So let's go to our next slide. So the way this book is organized is it's organized basically to cover, there are 5 major themes that kind of run along through all of biology. So I want you to be familiar with those themes. And really what I want you to do as the semester goes along is I want you, this is part of that critical thinking, like going above and beyond just learning the basics, but learning how to think. Whatever you're learning, I want you to come back to this slide or this page or this chapter and think, how is what I'm learning here? Maybe we're going to learn about genetics, right? We're going to learn how genes are combined when a mom and a dad mate to make an offspring that has a particular trait. How does that relate back to chapter 1, right? What one of these themes, or how does it relate to all of these themes, all right? And pretty much, if you get good at this, you should be able to connect anything you're learning back to these 5 themes. So it's a challenge. Have you ever heard of the 6 degrees of separation for Kevin Bacon? Or are you guys too young for that? Okay, well, when I was little, I grew up in Pennsylvania, and Kevin Bacon was from New Jersey. And there was this saying that most people could relate themselves. You know who Kevin Bacon is? He was in like Footloose, and I know he's been in a lot of things since Footloose, but that you could relate yourself to Kevin Bacon through 6 steps. So maybe it is my cousin who lives in Pittsburgh's roommate's housekeeper's daughter went to the same high school as Kevin Bacon in New Jersey, something like that, right? So there were 6 degrees of separation. So sometimes when you can use that idea to connect these things. So you might be in chapter 13 and you think, okay, how can I relate this back to 5 themes of biology? It might take you 6 or 7 things. You might have to say, well, the genes that you inherit from your parents are given to you through the process of meiosis. Then the chromosomes separate, and the chromosomes contain genes, and the genes have our DNA and have this structure, right? And then you might go a whole bunch of steps to get back to one of these themes. So don't get frustrated if you can't get there in one step. In fact, you shouldn't get there in one step. Try to make sure you're making all those connections the whole way through. Okay, so let's look at the themes. And we're going to go through each of them in a little bit more detail in a second. So right now we're just going to mention them. But basically that life is organized. And when we organize in some new way, we get these new properties that emerge. So we're going to talk about that. A really important theme is structure reflects function. I'm going to say that a lot over the semester. You're going to see that a lot over the semester. So that's one of those themes you want to come back to, basically stating that the way something is shaped reflects what it does, right? So you wouldn't want a square bike tire, right? The shape of your bike tire is circular because of what it has to do. It has to roll on the ground so you can ride your bike. The next theme is that anything for life processes to occur, it has to involve the expression and then transmission of genetic information. So we're going to talk about how our DNA codes for proteins that then function to make the cell work. All right, so we depend on that genetic information in our DNA to get the cell to do what it wants, and then of course we pass that DNA on to the next generation. So that's the transmission part. So there is a thing here that we're going to talk about called the central dogma. This is what I consider the core theme of any kind of biology. Everything that you learn in biology comes back to this, to the central dogma of molecular biology. So this is what I call my core theme, and pretty much I'm going to mention the central dogma in every single class that we have. Every single lesson outline, you're going to find that it refers to the central dogma in some way, okay? All right, the next one is that life requires energy and matter to be constantly transferred and transformed from one form to another. And then we're also going to find that living things have to interact with other living things and with their environment to be successful. And then the last one is what your book calls the major theme of the book, and that is evolution. So basically you can explain how living things are similar and then how very different living things are by understanding the idea of evolution and natural selection. Okay, so let's talk about each of them a little bit more. Theme 1 says that new properties emerge at every level of biological organization. And so this is kind of looking at it, you can kind of look at biology in different ways. You can say, we can be a reductionist. We can say, can studying something really little help us apply it to something else? We can do it from like a systems approach. So maybe if a really good example of this is Viagra. You've probably all heard of Viagra. So Viagra was a drug that was originally made to help people that had heart problems, because what it did is it increased blood flow. And one of the side effects that people were referring to were erections, right? And so here's how a drug that was designed to help one system do something actually affected another system in a different way. All right. So when we look at organisms, what we find is that this says small molecules right here, that as we start to put together small molecules to make larger molecules, make cells, then we put cells together to make tissues, and tissues together to make organs, and organs together to make a whole system, and the systems together to make a whole organism. You can see that it just gets more complex at every level. So we just keep combining things. And then when we do, we get some new function out of it, right? A cell by itself can't be skin, but you put cells all together to make an epithelial layer, now you have a protective layer, right? So, and then you put those different types of tissues together and you have a whole organ. But a heart doesn't work by itself, it needs arteries and veins to do its job, so you gotta hook it up to this system. And the arteries and veins don't know what to carry unless they're talking to other systems, like the digestive system to get nutrients and the respiratory system to get oxygen, right? And then so all of those systems have to work together to get the whole organism to work. And it's not just animals. This is a plant example down here. Plants have tissues, plants have organs, and those organs have to work together. For example, a leaf is an organ that does photosynthesis, but a leaf needs water to do photosynthesis. So it's got to be connected in some way to the roots down in the deep of the ground to get that water up to the leaves to get the photosynthesis done. And we're not really even done there. After we get an organism, we move on to organisms interacting with each other in the form of a population. So a population is all of one kind of species in one given location. And then if we consider those organisms of that population with another set of living organisms, so this deer with these birds, that's called a community. But then if we consider all the living organisms and the non-living things of a particular area, that's called an ecosystem. And you can consider an ecosystem wherever you want. You could talk about the ecosystem of your gut, or the ecosystem on the front of my phone, like what kind of bacteria are sitting there, or the ecosystem in my backyard, right? It just depends on what you want. Or it could be the ecosystem of the Rocky Mountains or something, right? And then if you combine all the ecosystems together, you get every niche on Earth has an ecosystem, you get our Earth, okay? It looks like our same hurricane is right where it is right now. I guess that's not the same place. Our hurricane's over here. All right, so let's just say we are asked this question. A scientist is studying the mating behaviors of a particular species of ants on the Trinity River banks in Fort Worth. Do you think they're studying a community, a biosphere, an ecosystem, a species, or a population? So we didn't really define species. So let's take a minute and define species. Anyone know what a species is? Anyway, well, you're defined as a species if you can mate with others of your same kind and have viable, fertile offspring, right? So some organisms, like you maybe heard of like a liger or a mule, right? A horse and a donkey can mate, and they actually can have a viable offspring. It's a mule, but it's not fertile. So donkeys and horses are not the same kind, right? In order to be the same kind, you have to have the same chromosomes and the same DNA. So what do you think the answer is to this question? Shazia, what's your question?
Could you repeat the question? Your voice kind of scratched out while you were saying it.
Say it again.
Could you repeat the question?
A scientist is studying the mating behaviors of a particular species of ants on the banks of the Trinity River in downtown Fort Worth. This scientist is studying either A, a community, B, a biosphere, C, an ecosystem, D, a species, or E, a population. So good job. E is the right answer, guys. Most of you are putting E. The reason why D isn't is ants everywhere could be part of that species, but if you're talking about a population, it's in a very given space. Good job. I told you about the idea of structure reflects function, and here's just a great picture to exhibit this, that this bird is going to eat nectar out of this plant and this flower, and you can see that the flower is kind of long and tubular. So in order for that bird to get nectar out of there, it's got to go way deep in there. So notice the shape of that bird's beak, right? So that is something that the shape of the beak reflects what that bird has to do in terms of eating out of that flower. This is just a picture here of a bunch of different kinds of cells and how they're different shaped, and they're shaped based on what they do. So for example, a red blood cell is a little red disc, has to fit through all of our capillaries and get where it needs to go, but a sperm cell, it looks like a little torpedo in a sense, because its job is to swim, right? It's got to swim, 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 and get through lots of different places. And so therefore they have different shapes. So make sure that you know what a cell is. And in lab this week, hopefully you talked about what a cell is and how you can differentiate a prokaryote from a eukaryote. So these are thinking questions that you need to take away with you from today and be able to answer. All right, the second theme is that life's processes involve DNA expression. So this is a picture of a DNA molecule. We're going to learn a lot about DNA this semester. You're going to start to recognize, you'll know this shape when the time comes. And I'm going to skip ahead a slide, I'm going to come back. So basically, DNA has information in it in the form of a gene that codes for proteins, all right? And a protein is basically a structure in the cell that does everything. A protein can make a chemical reaction happen, it can fight against a disease, it can give structure, it can transport things. Proteins do everything, all right, that the cell needs. All the processes and structures of the cell are defined by how what proteins are being made. And the information in the DNA tells the cell what proteins to make. So this is the flow of the central dogma of molecular biology. This is what I was telling you is what I think you can relate everything back to, is this flow of genetic information, or what's called gene expression. DNA has genes in it. So a little subset of the DNA codes, we make a copy of that gene in the form of RNA, and then we take that copy and we figure out a way to make it into a protein. And then that protein provides function or structure to the cell, and now the cell functions. Okay, so make sure you know this flow, DNA to RNA to protein, so that you can start to really build upon your understanding of the central dogma. So here's a great example. In your eye, in the lens of your eye, you need a particular protein called crystallin that makes up the lens of your eye. So these are proteins that make up the lens of your eye. So the proteins help the cells take on the shape that they need to be part of your lens and to function as a lens, right? So if we need this protein to get these cells so we can see, we get those proteins, and we have to go backwards in time here. The DNA, there's a little chunk of the DNA that has the code to make that protein. So that code is right here, gets copied into the form of an RNA. This orange thing here is an RNA. And then that RNA gets translated into the building blocks of proteins, which then fold up into the crystalline protein, they accumulate in the cells of the lens, and they allow your eye to see. Otherwise, you wouldn't get there. You wouldn't be able to get those proteins in your lens to see them. Isn't that cool? So that's the central dogma of molecular biology. Okay, the third theme is that life requires that energy and matter be transferred and transformed. And probably the best way to think about this is to think about this chemical cycling. So we have light energy coming from the sun, that's energy. Plants and other photosynthetic organisms convert that sunlight energy into chemical energy or sugars. And then other organisms eat the sugars to power their cells, right? And meanwhile, during all of this, heat is being released and lost from the ecosystem. The dead animals go down in the ground and decompose, and the fungi and the bacteria down here pull out the important chemicals that are important for the plants to do this whole process again. This is completely a fixed cycle. We can't remove any part of this cycle and still survive. So this is why it's important that we don't cut down all the trees in the world, because what happens is if we stop doing photosynthesis, at some point, it might take a while, there might be a little lag, but at some point, we're going to run out of sugar. And then we're not going to have anything to power our own cells. The fourth theme is that organisms interact with other things in their physical environment. And the best example of this is global warming, right? So we know that the environment affects organisms. And so there's this picture of this poor polar bear who's used to living on, you know, a big iceberg, and the iceberg is melting. So just let me take a minute to explain climate change to you, in case you're not familiar with it. So when living things consume energy, so when we eat sugar, we convert the sugar that we eat into energy, and a byproduct is carbon dioxide. All right, now there's carbon dioxide in our world. There's carbon dioxide that we can see. That's always been in our atmosphere. But one of the things that happens, that's been happening since humans have been around, is that not only are living organisms putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, but we are now burning fuels, fossil fuels, to run houses and businesses and industries, right? And the byproduct of that is, and running our cars, is also carbon dioxide. So now we're increasing the amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. It used to be a little bit, now it's a lot. And think of it like a blanket. You know, like if you're cold, you put a blanket on you, and the heat that's radiating off of your body gets trapped between you and the blanket, and you stay warm. Well, now what we're doing is we're putting all this carbon dioxide into our atmosphere. It's like a blanket. Sun is still shining up above, heating up the surface of the earth, and then all that heat is being caught in between the layer of the carbon dioxide and the earth's surface. And so the more carbon dioxide we put into the atmosphere, the thicker that blanket gets. And so the more we're keeping that temperature warmer. And I know it seems kind of crazy because some places get cold while other places get hot, but those are just the side effects of the whole system changing. Yes, some places get windier, some places have more hurricanes, some places have really hot summers, other places have really cold places. So it's all a cycle of reaction to that thing. And I know, I agree, that poor polar bear, right? All right, so I have like 2 minutes left. Oh, I just want to talk about this real quick. When we're thinking about things interacting with other things, this is a great example. So this is a protein, this is an enzyme, okay, that is used to turn this blue structure into this blue structure, and it's like an assembly line, right? So in order to make this blue thing orange, we have to go through assembly line A, B, C, and D to get to our end product, all right? But when we get to the end product, We're done. We don't need to make any more. So we need to turn this whole process off, right? So the way we can turn it off is this end product can go back and say, hey, stop, go back to this original purple enzyme and say, stop what you're doing and don't keep making this until we need it again. So this is called feedback inhibition. So it's kind of like a car dealership might say, we have 20 Corvettes on the lot. Stop making Corvettes right now until we sell what's here. When we get down low, we'll let you know to start making some more. Okay, that's called feedback inhibition. All right, now I only have 1 minute. The last theme is evolution. And this is what your book calls the core theme. And so very quickly, I'm going to talk to you about, I'll go back to that one real quick. The fact that when you look at living things in some ways are so very much the same. Every living thing is made of a cell. Each one of the cells out there has DNA in it, and that DNA participates in that idea of the central dogma to make proteins. Every cell has a membrane, it has cytoplasm, it has ribosomes. Any cell you want is going to have all of those things. You could pull a cell out of a jellyfish and an oak tree leaf and a bacteria infection and a polar bear's salivary gland, and the cells would look identical in the sense that they would have a membrane, cytoplasm, DNA, and ribosomes. That's amazing. They're all the same. However, does an oak tree look like a jellyfish, like a bacteria, like a polar bear? No, right? So in that same moment, you have it all the same, but then it's so different, right? How can it look so different? Well, evolution and natural selection help us explain how we can have such a difference. Okay, so I have to stop there because it's 2. So I'm going to go ahead and stop, but I promise for this little section on evolution, I'll start right here. Oops, right here. Nope, there. I will voice over, make a little video for this last part of the lecture for chapter 1 and post it so that you can still hear the rest of it after this. Okay, so I'm going to stop recording right now. Does anybody have